Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of History 102 with our new host, Austin Paget. And today's topic is ancient Israel. At the start of the Medieval England video, what I said is that there are certain eras of history in which, when you look at them, you see something that seemed completely unimportant and obscure at the time in a very small area. In that, implicit to this particular era of history is the idea that very small groups of people in very small places can completely alter the course of human history. And ancient Israel is a great example of that, because modern Israel is an area the size of New Jersey. However, what you find is in this time period, you're operating on something like half of that size. And then once you read more about the topic, you realize that the Jews themselves were incredibly divided. There were at least 12 different tribes, all with different motivations, all with different cultures. And what was going on is that a handful of the tribes were pulling along the rest of Israel. And a very small group of people made what was potentially the greatest breakthrough in world history, that being the breakthrough towards monotheistic religions. And it's remarkable, and it's really inspirational that this very small group of people made the breakthrough to monotheism, and now a majority of the human race has a religion that stems ultimately from a Jewish foundation.
Yeah, going back to monotheism at the core, you'll hear some people in India kind of claim that they invented it. Maybe they created some building blocks as a precursor to it, but obviously their religion is pretty unmonotheistic. But yeah, it's pretty clearly a big category difference in human thought.
The other interesting variable here is that the Jews are still here somehow, where you look at the map of the world at the time, where let's go to 1000 BC. You have Egypt, you have Babylon, you have Assyria, you have the Phoenicians, you have the Israelites. And of everyone on the map at that point, the only one who's really there are the Jews. And you can nitpick and say that there are some Assyrian Christians, or the Armenians are still there. But if you were to go back to someone and tell them that of this entire ecosystem, the only player that's still left is the Jews. And the Jews, their dominant population center is in Israel right now. Besides it, it's in North America. North America was so far away from Israel that they barely knew Spain existed, let alone the New World. And the Jews are emblematic that life is not fair and life is not simple. Because in modernity, with the materialist paradigm, we like to imagine that everything that happens is this chain reaction predicated upon the most reasonable probabilistic assessment from each variable. What that means, for example, when we study the world wars, we're trying to figure out how it was inside the incentive structure of each of the players to make the decisions they did. Then you look over this is one of those things that's a faith-based argument, depending on how you want to perceive the world. There's like 10 ways you can there's not 10. There's infinite ways to perceive the world, many of which are more correct than others. But you look at the history of the Jews and you think, what the fuck happened there? Because did you see the meme with where according to UN statistical projections, Finland is within a standard deviation of not existing. What that means is that the way the UN statistical projections work is that due to places like the third world, that there's a 50 million or so in places like India or China, for example, the population numbers are so large that you're operating with standard deviations of like 50 million people. And for China, it's way more, actually, where China says they have 1.4 billion people. They really have probably below a billion people, because commies lie about numbers. But for the Jews, they are something like 15 million people, which is like my home state of Pennsylvania. And they've changed the course of history so much. And it makes you believe in God up to a certain point, because you're thinking, yeah, the story is so ridiculously insane. It's hard to believe that the universe is probabilistic.
Well, that relates to the life is not fair, not simple. If you
Yeah.
don't view life as simple, it's easier to understand how it could not be fair because in the chaos, things are going to get lost, and that kind of translates into an unpredictability view. And then in terms of inhabiting the region for a while, I know there's some differences between the genetics of the modern population. A lot of people talk about how the current inhabitants of Israel, a lot of them came from Eastern Ukraine, but you also mentioned uh, there's a continuity of thought and community that went beyond the genetics. It's like the genetics changed, but the culture remained.
Yeah. And so you have three populations of Jews today. You have the Ashkenazi, you have the Mizrahi, and you have the Sephardic. And the Ashkenazi is a word for German because they were originally from the German Rhineland, and then they moved out to Eastern Europe. Most American Jews are Ashkenazi, and the Ashkenazi used to be the poorer Jews, and then they became the wealthier ones due to entering the industrialized world. And they are about 60% originally Levantine populations and 40% Italian and French ancestry, which we'll get to at the end of this video, because this video will go from Abraham until the forced Jewish diaspora a little bit after the birth of Christ. The Sephardic Jews are genetically identical to the original Levantine population, although there was more genetic flux than we'd like to imagine, where most Jews today have ancestors from the Maccabee period, where, keep in mind, again, this area the size of New Jersey had this constant Darwinistic struggle. And so modern Jewish populations, like the Mizrahi or the Middle Eastern Jews and the Sephardic Jews, they are descended from the original Levantine area, but the Jews over the period of thousands of years cannibalized other peoples in that region and assimilated them, which is the historically normal thing, by the way. If you look at a country like France or China, single core population assimilates genetically similar populations. And we found there's the Khazar hypothesis because, strangely enough, there was a Jewish state in the Caucasus in the 600s and 700s. And this is one of those, again, this is one of those things where it seems like the simulation is laughing at us, where the Khazars were this Turkic steppe people living on the grassland north of the Caucasus, and they adopted Judaism because it was an Abrahamic religion that allowed them to, because once you get beyond a certain level of civilizational complexity, you have to take in an axial age religion just to manage the level of social complexity of your society. But then the Khazars thought, wait, if we convert to Islam or Christianity, we are making ourselves subservient to either Byzantium or the Islamic Caliphate. So we're going to troll everyone and be Jews. But the Khazars were wiped out first by the Viking Rus, and then secondarily by the Cumans and the Pechenegs and the Mongols. And the Ashkenazi Eastern European Jewish population, they have basically no genetic influence from the Khazars.
Right. Yeah, that was funny that it was a way to remain independent and also be able to play both sides, which is what you see of nations that are in between powers and kind of an open land, maybe like Poland or maybe like Ukraine. Their history is always deciding who to partner with.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't have the luxury of going the Switzerland route. Maybe they made a mistake, but they always end up kind of making bets on one side or another, and that's their whole foreign policy struggle.
To start with the explanation of how the Jews were founded, in Spenglerian analysis, you have 2,000-year civilizational cycles. And much like in Lord of the Rings, we are currently at the end of the Third Age, where the first civilizational cycle was the River Valley civilizations culminating in the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC. And then the second civilizational cycle started with the Bronze Age collapse, and then it ended with the fall of Rome. And so the first civilizational cycle is like Egypt, Babylon, Indus Valley. Second is Greece, Persia, India, China. Then the third cycle is fall of Rome until Mouse Utopia. And of course, I don't actually know if Mouse Utopia is going to kill us, but I look at the variables around us, and it appears as if we are winding down the third cycle because we're burning through the cultural institutions that we formed in the aftermath of the. My microphone died. We're burning through the cultural institutions we formed in the aftermath of the fall of Rome, and I will need to establish new cultural institutions. But apologies. Okay, my microphone now. So the Jews have an interesting habit that with each civilizational cycle, they are the people who call the previous civilizational cycles bluff. Where Judaism was the ideology that came out from the culmination of civilizational cycle one, Judaism formed around the time of the Bronze Age collapse as a rejection of both the Semitic Fertile Crescent civilization and Egyptian civilization, because both had become stultified and decadent. Then civilizational cycle two, Christianity was formed by the Jews to call the bluff of Greco-Roman civilization. Civilizational cycle three, the Jews formed Marxism to call the bluff of the world civilizations of the industrial world. And so the Jews exist like this passive nuclear core that's incredibly creative, but they make cultural formations that erode the social foundations of the neighboring societies. And so you saw that with Judaism, Christianity, and with Marxism. And so I see the Jews as a sort of creative population where, in that, at least the way they perceive themselves is as God's chosen people. So the Jews take all these creative essences from the ether and then they transform them into new cultural forms. And Jewish culture has a tremendous amount of ritual taboos and moral prescriptions and that stuff, I believe, as a way to keep themselves from going crazy due to the constant creative tension they have.
Right, like kind of like forced discipline in a
Yeah.
creative person. And then what do you mean by the creation of Marxism? Because I know there's a lot of different thought, and we've talked about different influences, and you have people who think that the Protestant Reformation was Marxist. You have some people who think it led to the erosion of certain protections that made it vulnerable to Marxist takeover. There's other people that think that it's branches of the Enlightenment, so different interpretations. And I think it's probably some combination where, right, there's no new idea under the sun. So we're probably looking at this kind of um, Jewish influence porting on to an already existing strain of
Yes.
Protestantism, really them adopting the ideas and working with the ideas of the society that they're in. Like Marx was being born in an area of Germany that, oh, no, not Marx's birth. The first Marxist political party in Germany was in a Calvinist area where the University of Wittenberg existed, and the kind of along with Cambridge and Harvard kind of pushed the similar ideas. So that's probably the substrate that they're operating on top of.
To start, I really hate talking about this topic, and I am about to write the Jewish civilization video. I've done the research already. The next video I'm going to release next week is the anthropology of totalitarianism. Then I'm writing Jewish civilization. I already have the thesis for the video, but I really don't like talking about this. It's funny I chose to talk about this, but because whenever I talk the JQ, it's like I'm arguing with a bunch of children with power tools, where they won't listen to the full sentence you're saying because they're already using the fucking power tool to tear the house down. And I'm like, okay, if you could sit down and talk to me for a paragraph before letting your emotions take over, we could have a real discussion here. And what I say is that there's the rule of responsibility, where it's very easy to draw any kind of argument that leads to any point. You can create a causal narrative of a sub-variety of different things. And the reality is the universe is intensely complicated. And so there's multiple different sub-narratives going on at once, where I like to say, if you're not using at least 5 variables to explain why something's happened, you haven't done it right. And so with the origin of the left, for example, it's clear that this is multiple influences, and Jews were vastly disproportionate in the origin of the left, but also were lots of other groups. So Marxism was created by a Jew. That's just like a fact. It's like a fact. But leftist philosophy was formed by the French. And so if you look at almost every idea on the modern left or socialism, it was developed by French thinkers around the time of the French Revolution. Then it was ported onto Calvinists. And I have said before that the left is formed from a combination of Calvinist, French, Jewish, female, and bureaucratic interests. And if you want to know more, watch my video on the anthropology of the left. But when you look at Christianity as an example, because if we're saying Marxism was made by a Jew, we also have to say Christianity was made by a Jew. And my attitude here is I strip things down to the most basal level, where I look at the underlying fact where both Christ and Marx were genetically 100% Jewish. And they came from a Jewish cultural foundation and that stuff. But also you look at early Christianity. Early Christianity had a tremendous amount of Hellenic Greek influence. It had influences from Zoroastrianism. It had a lot of Christianity is seeping with ancient Egyptian symbolism as well. And so, or there's parts from Mithraism where my attitude here is that with a lot of the JQ arguments is that if you want to say, so let's say you said the English nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki because you look at the genetic composition of the American government, it was lots of people of English ancestry. But past a certain threshold, you have attained an organic independent whole that's called America. Or if you say if the Romans conquered Gaul, or not if the when the Romans did conquer Gaul, Gaul developed this new identity called France that was partly derivative of Rome's identity. And so the way history works is that there's the constant crashing in reformulation of new identities. And I try to keep things relatively simple, where if something acts out of its own interest, it's a new identity. So past a certain threshold, the left or Christianity became their new organic wholes, independent from the original Jewish origin, where you look at when a new ideology starts turning on the Jews, you know that it's become its own animal. Where the Christians turned on the Jews almost immediately when they became the state-sanctioned religion, and then Marxists turned on Jews almost immediately once they got into power as well, where Stalin had a tremendous amount of discrimination against the Jews. And so this is why I said the Jews are like a nuclear core. They're incredibly creative, but they bring into fruition ideas that are more powerful than them.
And just ideas in general that maybe people were on the line of discovering, right?
Yeah.
Because you go back to the beginning, you can drop connections from Christianity onto modern thought and individual sovereignty and trains of thought. And then you have leftists who try and claim that their ideas represent the scripture. And then there's the ideas themselves, right? So you have the train of thought. The ideas are building up over time, different thinkers contributing. It's kind of like building an airplane. You know, if the airplane's being built and then you adjust the wings and make this part, does it become a Jewish airplane, or because Christianity was started by a Jew, or because one kind of continuation and thinking along a line at some point was done by a Jew? What societies are these ideas portable in? What societies do they fit in? What what continuation of thought are they a part of? Seems like easier systems levels ways to think about the impact of the ideas. And like you said, you need multiple explanations for things, and that's why systems thinking is good, because it's an underlying logic, and then that helps you identify maybe 5 different things that contributed to a process. But if your explanation is only the Jews, when you take that element out, you're left with no explanation for the world.
Yes.
When there's plenty of things to point at to figure that it would have happened this way, regardless of that
That's a
element.
that's a great point, and it ports really well in the start of this video. So I'm going to say two things. The first is I'm going to shill a philosophic idea I've discovered. Where a philosophic idea I've developed is called fifth point objectivity, where fifth point objectivity is the ability to assess each it's a combination of empathy and empiricism, in which you assess each independent player in the game, and then you assess their empirical actions, and also you assess their positional understanding of the environment. So the way fifth point objectivity works is you look at European history, you assess the French, you assess the Italians, you assess the English, you assess their narrative about what they're doing, and then you assess their empirical actions, and then you assess which narratives are empirically closer to the reality. Well, it's a combination of empathy and empiricism, so you're capable of establishing a multipolar sense of reality in which your sense of reality is a combination of a sub-variety of independent narratives, which you try to smash down with a hammer so that you're capable of establishing the narrative that survives the empirical test of reality the hardest.
Yep. And the best way to do that is to get more systems focused and less like chains of groups and organizations and people and combinations of
Yes.
secret influences. Because, yeah, there are people with agendas and there are quotes you can find, and it goes all the way across the board. But if you try and life is too complicated to figure it out that way. You're always going to get something wrong. You're always going to overestimate or underestimate something. You have to look at it from the system's perspective.
Yes. And what you said is a great point where the Jews, the reason they formed the Abrahamic tradition is that they were at a crossroads. And I am going to explain the Jews in the strangest way possible. I was once driving from California out to Texas, and I'm from Pennsylvania. And one of the things I've said many times before, because it's true, is that as an American who's lived around America, no one ever explained to me how internally diverse America is. Where Pennsylvania is super different from California, from New England, from Florida. And then driving across the Southwest, I ran into this demographic who's apparently called desert trash, where, and I don't know if that's offensive in your people's culture. If it is, you can tell me. Because, like, poor white trash is a term of pride, redneck's a term of pride. But the desert trash are a population that lives out in the middle of the inner American desert, as they called it in the 1800s, or let's say Sierra Nevadas out to Nebraska. And in the desert, you find these trailer park populations where people live in these communities out in the middle of nowhere. And they have this weird combination, a culture that's a combination of like Mad Max and degeneracy and rednecks and gun culture. I find them really anthropologically interesting because as a person from Pennsylvania, I had no idea these people existed. And the desert trash people, they're often actually quite worldly, because if they ended up in the middle of nowhere, they're often from a different part of the country. They've often been through a lot. They often actually know a surprising amount about a surprising amount of different places. But you would never know that driving through, seeing the trailer parks with the trash everywhere. And so when you look at desert trash culture in America, you're looking at these people who are basically shoved away by the cruelty of, I think modern America is a pretty cruel system, actually. It's a pretty cruel system of exploitation. And the people end up in the desert because they're just tired of the constant exploitation and cruelty of the cities. And I'm not going to over-glorify this culture that much. There's lots of drug use and abuse and that stuff, but it's often very individually minded people who made an active decision to move out to the desert. At least I could be wrong. This is my best comprehension of their culture. And when you're looking at the Jews in the late Bronze Age period, it's a lot like that, where the Jews were a accumulation of people who were rejected by a collapsing civilization, and they started hanging out in the periphery of the Fertile Crescent system until they found a leader like Moses who was capable of congregating them. And the second group that I'm going to compare the Jews to in that same region of the world, because you often find climactic similarities between populations that share nothing else. Like I find similarities between Celtic and British or Japanese culture as an example. Similar climates, very different everything else. And so I find certain similarities in the American West and Jewish culture, because it's both desert climates. And the Mormons are actually the group who I compare most to the early Jews, because the Mormons are actually a breakaway population where if you analyze Mormon genetics, they're genetically identical to New England Yankees. And if you look at the genetic map of America, you just have this settlement of Yankees that have taken over the Intermountain West, being the Mormons. But the Yankees were formed under their prophet Joseph Smith in the early 1800s, and they were so bizarre that they were rejected from the rest of American society. So they started out in upstate New York and Vermont. They kept getting bumped west until they hit Utah. And then out in the desert, they formed their own community. And the Mormons are known for being very strange, where they have lots of strange ritual taboos, like you spiritually get a planet in the sky, and they allowed polygamy, and like there's certain brands of underwear, and you're not allowed to drink or have caffeine. Some of this stuff's true, some of it's not. There's a lot of weird myths here, but I am fallible. You should fact check me. And the Mormons are known for having one of the most intact communities in America because through all these taboos, they've ritually selected for people who are who have a very high in-group cohesion. So the Mormons are known for being very hardworking, paying their taxes, being very clean. And there's a term called a pod person, and a pod person is he's run into someone like a Mormon, where they have these positive traits, but if you're from a different region of America, you're like, who the hell are you guys? Because they put off this like vaguely cult vibe. And so when you're looking at the early Jews, it's the population which I actually find them to be most similar to are the Mormons, because when the other cultures around the world look at the Jews, they're like, we kind of admire your family structure and your moral structure and how intact your community is, but you guys do a lot of really weird stuff. And we forget this. So the Jews of the ancient world saw the other populations around them comparably to how a Mormon would see Los Angeles. And like they'd see it as a place of complete demonic degeneracy. And then the other populations saw the Jews the way, let's say, people in the West Coast would see Mormons.
And it's interesting coming from the Northeast and being Yankees because they are really not aligned with Yankees in very many ways, politically or relative to the power, the structure at all.
I see some. So with the Mormons, they're a breakaway of a traditional Yankee culture that's degraded. Because having lived in New England's really sad to watch because you saw the most cohesive population in history. Where 200 years ago, the New England Yankees were the hardest working, they were the most technologically advanced, most highest social cohesion. And then the death of religion in New England's killed their previous social structure. And now the rural New England and non-upper class New England is one of the saddest places I've seen in the country because you go to the towns in rural Maine or New Hampshire and it's just complete social breakdown. It looks like everyone's on drugs and no one has stable work. And if you assess for cost of living, rural New England is poorer than even the Deep South. So,
Yeah, the county of New York I grew up in is actually, I think, the poorest county in New York, the biggest
yeah,
welfare county, and it also has about the same amount of cows as
yeah,
people. So it's a weird, it's like you can picture an industrial city where the whole blocks are taken out, but this is
yeah,
more like a Swiss cheese where you see like dilapidated house here or there, kind of like a slow
yes.
decline. And there's a lot of opportunity still to pull it back. And there's some cool things going on with people moving out of the city. But yeah, if it can get freed from the cities that politically control it, it could be one of the most vital areas in the country.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's useful to see the Mormons as the extension of the Puritan spirit that settled New England. Religious fanaticism, super intact communities, migrating to a faraway land, make a city on a hill. But I'm going to throw my cards out. We know literally nothing about the era the Jews were from. And the Bronze Age is one of those time periods where I have bought almost every single book on the Bronze Age collapse because our next episode's going to be the Bronze Age collapse. And that's easy because there's 2 or 3 books in the topic, where I wish we could redirect 5% of the time we spent on studying the Battle of Stalingrad to the Bronze Age. And the Bronze Age world is the end of cycle. The late Bronze Age is the end of cycle 1. And with that, you saw a highly complex system that was exploitive and was running off fumes. And if we know very little about the Dark Age that came with the fall of Rome, we know even less with the Dark Age that came after the fall of the Bronze Age. And the only two societies that had any kind of records in the Bronze Age, Dark Age were Egypt and Babylon. And Canaan existed in this weird place. Canaan was the previous term for Israel. And so there's almost no records of this time period. And in the same way where we don't really know if King Arthur existed, it's hard to actually suss out the accuracy of any of the variables because the foundation of Jewish civilization occurred in the Dark Age that came after the fall of the Bronze Age world. And furthermore, the Jews were a low class, basically, they were the equivalent of the desert trash populations, where in that era of history, the only records you keep are from the great and the powerful, like kings or wealthy merchants or state documents. And so no one was recording what the lower class people were doing. And so the Jews formed as this population on the edge of multiple previous civilizations, which gave them an advantage because they could see the failings of multiple different worldviews and then integrate into a sort of unified worldview where Abraham, who we've genetically proved his existence, Abraham is the father of the Jews, where we have a Y chromosome analysis of people who claim descent from Abraham. And that Y chromosome shows that there was a shared ancestor in that region of the world among the people who claim descent from Abraham in that time period. And Abraham came from Uruk, or modern Mesopotamia, and he fled the degeneracy of Uruk. And the story went that Abraham made a deal with God that his people would be God's chosen people. And that God told him to sacrifice his son for his unquestioning obedience. And then Abraham, when he was going to do it, God said, you don't have to. And implicit in those two stories is actually a very profound religious breakthrough the Jews made in that time period.
And what is that breakthrough?
So the issue with the previous civilizational cycle 1 is that it was not capable of objectivity. And Amaury de Riancourt, one of my favorite, or actually Amaury is my favorite author. Amaury had this idea of the masculine revolution around 1000 AD. And what that entailed was that in Persia, Greece, and Israel, you saw the breakthrough towards human ability to be objective against environments. And John Vervaeke, who is a professor of philosophy and religion, he talks about how the previous civilizations like Egypt and Babylon, they saw all of human existence as a continuation of the natural order, where the pharaoh was like a lion who would eat the lesser animals, and that human society was an extension of the natural environment, where there was no clear demarcation between gods and men and nature, which is why you have animal gods. And the problem implicit in that system is that it was incapable of actually creating mental divisions from its environment. And so it would end up pushing the innate issues with the natural world pretty far. So it's an exploitive system, it's a cruel system, it's a stupid system, because city people don't know how nature works, but nature is really dumb and brutal. And so when the Jews were trying to escape the degeneracy of the earlier civilization, they saw stuff like worshiping idols. And the Jews were very much against idol worship, where in the previous society, you would make like a clay statue, and the clay statue was literally supposed to be a god. I can explain the philosophy there if you'd like, but the people would worship a clay statue. And in the story of Moses in Sinai, they throw away Yahweh to worship the idol of the cow. And you would also have ceremonial prostitution, where the gods would have literal prostitutes who would have sex. And through that process, they would demonstrate the natural fecundity of the world. So the previous social order had degraded into moral degeneracy and stupidity. And there was lots of stuff where in the native populations of Canaan, they would sacrifice children, where Moloch and Baal were two important gods from the Canaanite religion, because the entire in between Mesopotamia and Egypt, and this is a useful fact no one will tell you that took me forever to figure out, is that there was this unified Syrian cultural region that stretched, and we call them Aramaeans because when people study the Bible, they'll say Jesus spoke in Aramaean. And Aramaean was the Syrian language, and it became the predominant language of the Persian Empire and that whole region of the world, because although the Aramaeans were not militarily that important, they were the dominant traders and the dominant administrators and that stuff. And so the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, and the Aramaeans were part of this Syrian population that stretched on the Levantine shore. And the Jews were originally part of that population, and they went to great effort to differentiate themselves from the other Aramaeans. And so with the local Aramaean population, from an Abrahamic perspective, they basically worshipped demons because they were worshiping spiritual forces that they were worshiping basically petty and cruel spiritual forces that you sacrifice to in order to placate them. And so you would have lots of stuff like animal sacrifice or ritual prostitution or anything like that. And what the Jews were trying to do was to establish an independent monotheistic moral axis to break away from that animalistic religion.
Right. Separating us from the animals, holding to a higher standard of behavior. And how does the sacrifice of the child in the Abraham story correlate to that? Is that because that's a very unnatural thing to do? You also have examples of, in nature that happening. So how does that square?
The point that was trying to be conveyed there is that, so in the previous religion, sacrificing your own son was not uncommon. In Syrian Aramaean culture, if the nobility sacrificed their own children, that was the ultimate sacrifice that someone could do to appease the gods, because they were trying to explain statistical concepts they didn't have the understanding of statistics. So the reason they did human sacrifice was to show the natural world that we are willing to take necessary sacrifices to please you. And what happened with the masculine objective revolution around 1000 BC is the breakaway from purely trying to placate the natural order to dominating it. And so with Abraham's breakthrough, you saw the concept of we want to relate to God directly rather than submitting to the natural order. And things get pretty murky from here because we don't have very good records of Jewish history until around 1000 BC when Solomon and David formed the kingdom. And according to the Bible, which is basically the only record we have from this time period, the Jews were based out of, they started out around Uruk and they moved to modern Israel. Then they went to Egypt. And no one has any idea what's going on in this time period. If anyone gives you a narrative, assume it's incorrect because we have no evidence. It's like King Arthur, as I said before. And I choose to lean on the Bible because on the spectrum of these things, I tend to trust ancient authors more than normal people, and I can explain why. But I think modern history writing basically treats historic thinkers as vastly more stupid than they really were. And if you have no authors, I choose to trust the legend as the only source of info we have. And according to the legends, the Jews started out, or they reached Egypt, and they were part of the Egyptian imperial apparatus. And they worked as slaves, and Egypt didn't have slaves in this time period, but if they were serfs, there's some things where they think it's slave as a mistranslation of serf or someone who lives in bondage. And Egypt was a multicultural cosmopolitan civilization where Egypt actually had lots of ethnic minorities and they controlled the entire Levantine shore up to modern Anatolia. And so the Jews were part of that. And we have the first records we have are the Egyptian Saga Hill called the Habiru. And the Habiru were basically a class of bandits. At least this is how I remember it. They were a class of bandits who formed their own ethnic identity, and they were on the fringe between Egypt and Israel. And so we have a handful of records of the Habiru, and then there's this whole historic discussion on if the Habiru were the modern Jews. But Habiru, Hebrew, on the border between Egypt and Israel in a sort of servile state, it adds up too much.
Yeah, that's funny because it was going to be my guess a second ago without knowing this backstory that whichever group of Israelites or Canaanites were in Egypt, they would have had exposure to different things that gave them advantages. And you could see once they left that area, teaming up with the people that were able to exist in the borderlands and be a little gritty, you could see how they could then become the dominant faction
Yes.
in their native land when they return.
Another variable here is the Egyptians developed monotheism, where Egypt had an incredibly advanced mystic philosophic tradition, where the Egyptians so in the book of Exodus, where Moses beats the Egyptian magicians, that's a huge plot point because the Egyptians were seen as having incredibly powerful magic in this time period. So beating an Egyptian magician would be the magical equivalent of the Taliban taking on the American government, a completely outgunned opponent. And it's supposed to show that the Abrahamic Yahweh is a true God. And with the book of Exodus, the Jews wandered out left Egypt under Moses. And we don't know if Moses was a figure. I'm going to lean towards he was, because for founder effect reasons, I think it's hard to make up a Moses. Where when you look at something like this, where the Jews were pulled together from a series of discrete different elements into forming a single people, that requires something like an incredible leader. And so it wouldn't surprise me if I would be surprised if Moses wasn't there, even if we don't have facts for him. As well as when you combine formation of a singular idea with pulling a group of a sub-variety of different threads, that sounds like it requires real leadership. And nothing in the book of Exodus, which was the book of the Jews leaving Egypt for Israel, seems that out of place. It seems completely historically plausible. And it's funny, people are like, how could this possibly happen? And I'm thinking the ancient world constantly had barbarian invasions, and there were many coming out of Arabia because the Jews were part of these constant Arabic migrations that left the Arabian desert for neighboring kingdoms. When the Babylonians were one of them, the Akkadians were another, I was going to say recent, but it's 1500 years ago, the most recent under the Prophet Muhammad. And so Arabia spawns out Semitic peoples that attack outwards. And to jump back to a thread I forgot about, Egypt, a century beforehand, had a monotheistic emperor called Akhenaten, where Egypt was under the control of this constrictive theocracy. And the Middle East has been run by theocracies for almost its entire history. And part of the reason the Jews made the breakthrough to monotheism is because Egypt and Babylon had ossified into these set priest classes that shut down creativity. And because Israel was on the frontier of multiple different civilizations, it could incorporate these very advanced ideas that the pre-established civilizations were too fossilized to do so. So you see a sub-variety of other religious concepts where Egypt had a pharaoh who tried to shut down the old gods and make in Egypt a monotheistic religion. And keep in mind, according to the Bible, Moses was a prince of Egypt. And that sounds ridiculous, but keep in mind the pharaoh would have had thousands of women he'd sleep with. There were probably thousands of princes of Egypt, especially the pharaoh. I think it was a custom in the ancient world that the pharaoh and rulers like that would sleep with a bunch of different subpopulations inside their empires so that they could establish a leadership class of the conquered peoples. Basically, the pharaoh sleeps with women of different conquered sub-nations inside the empire so the children can dominate those subpopulations better. And given what was going on at the Egyptian courts at the time, it makes sense that someone from that era would take monotheism, which had failed in Egypt, and then incorporate it into a different idea. And you'll also see lots of Mesopotamian concepts in early Judaism or in the Abrahamic tradition, where the flood myth being kicked out of Eden and the Leviathan and a sub variety of other concepts you see in the Abrahamic tradition stem from Mesopotamian myth. And I'm reading Mircea Eliade now, and he goes through all these Mesopotamian myths, and you can see how this rippled into the Abrahamic tradition, where due to their strategic position, the Jews were capable of bringing in all these religious concepts from the entire Fertile Crescent region.
Yep, it makes sense because they were on the frontier, like you said. They can incorporate these ideas without having the attachment to, they can pick and choose without having an ego attachment to something
Yeah.
that maybe is viewed as being tied to the success of Babylon or Egypt in the past. They were kind of a natural point. Even when they weren't getting attacked, the armies would go through their region in the Levant because it was the only walking path along the
Yeah.
coast between the Hittites, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians. Um, and usually they would get conquered along the way because it's easier to build out when you conquer the people you're passing through. Otherwise, you're going to have a hard time uh, building an attack out of that region.
The way I see the Bible is the Jews started out in one of the most difficult spawn points on the map, where literally Syria and Israel is the place that's faced the most conquest in human history because it exists at the crossroads between Europe, Asia, and Africa. It's in the middle of the map. And the Jews were this tiny, completely unimportant group, so they had to figure out how to win the game while they're completely unmatched by larger empires surrounding them, like Babylon or Egypt or the Greeks or Persians or whatever. And so they started talking to the simulation to figure out how to hack the game, and they started introspecting. And the Jews had a greater degree of introspection than any other population in that time period. And the way I see the Bible is that it's a let's play in video game terms. It's one of the players stuck at the most difficult start points, and then it's how they played the game. Because the Bible was composed over the course of 3,000 years, every single thing you can face in human nature, the Jews did face. They faced they faced conquering a native land. They faced subjugation. They faced being genocided. They faced decadence. They faced increasing inequality. They faced state formation. So the Jews faced so many experiences from being stuck at the middle of the map that the Bible was their assessment of what strategies did and did not work. And what they consistently found was that loyalty to God was the consistent strategy that got them to win. And this region of the world was one of the first places to develop a concept of history, because the differing civilizations meant that you actually saw changes due to one group conquering another. And with the Old Testament, what you're seeing is the accumulation of millennia of records of trying to assess what were the correct and incorrect decisions that they were making, which the bigger civilizations didn't do because they weren't as desperate. And so the Jews consistently found with the Old Testament is that each time the strategy that worked was loyalty to God. So they developed a system of what kinds of loyalty to God worked, and then that became the Abrahamic tradition, where the pattern of the Old Testament, which is something that's writ across human history in general, is good times means you leave God, then that results in bad times, which means your loyalty to God again, then the cycle restarts, and so you should be loyal to God the whole time.
It's literally the cycle of chaos and tyranny, which maps onto state formation. It's like how we study the past thousands of years of governments is what the Bible was relative to the
Yeah.
period before that. A lot of the messages, like you said, you're looking at different things, but that people did wrong, but you're also looking at an underlying consistent theme
Yes.
that inevitably leads to this cycle of chaos and tyranny if you
Yes.
don't figure it out.
And uh, so with the book of Exodus, the Jews wandered through the desert and then they attacked into modern Israel, which they called the land of milk and honey. And having been to the Middle East, it's ridiculous they called Israel the land of milk and honey because the entire region is so dry.
Well, that's
And
why you need some milk and honey, I guess.
it's better than the desert, though. But at that time period, the region genuinely was much wetter and much cooler, where they had huge cedar forests in Lebanon, as an example, and Iraq had swamplands. But they conquered the local Canaanite population who were civilizationally degenerate. And one of the points Will Durant makes in this book, Our Oriental Heritage, is that the Ten Commandments are an evolutionary strategy of how to prioritize group moral codes to increase effectiveness against other groups. Because once the Jews conquered Canaan, they were a small ruling class. They were a small population surrounded by a much larger majority population. So the Jews made the Ten Commandments where, okay, guys, if we don't attack each other, if we can make a moral code that's based upon in-group cooperation, then we can outcompete other groups. And it also, a big part of the Jewish moral code is increasing fecundity, basically increasing their birth rate against other populations. And with the formation of the Jewish state, which also, when Joshua conquered Jericho, Jericho was one of the oldest cities in the world. Jericho was formed 6000 BC. So it's remarkable that when Joshua was conquering it in around the 12th century BC, Jericho is already 5,000 years old at least. And to understand how ridiculous that is, the pyramids, that Jericho was as old at the time as Joshua as the pyramids are to us. And then from that, you see the attempts the Jews make for state building. This is interesting to see because in some ways it's paradigmatic for state building in general, where the Jews were 12 different tribal peoples. And again, it's remarkable that we're dealing with such a small region. And then we're also dealing with such a small population inside those. Because like, how many people were in one of those Jewish tribes? Like 1,000 people? 10,000 people? You're dealing with pretty small population numbers. And reading early Jewish history, it just feels like a bunch of tribes constantly squabbling with each other. And sometimes religious breakthroughs have as a side effect of squabbling. But reading about this time period, you're just in awe of just the constant internal squabbling. And somehow some religious breakthroughs came about from it. And they were split between Israel and Judea, which were the two different kingdoms. And the Jews were surrounded on all sides, where they had other neighboring kingdoms like Edom and the Philistines. And the Jews were one of the most primitive peoples in that area, where we know about the Philistines. And it's absolutely hilarious. The Philistines have been remembered as, like, the term Philistine means culturally barbaric, because the Philistines were more advanced than the Jews in almost every conceivable way. The Jews were not an urban people. They were a barbarian desert people who took over cities and then Israel degraded. The Philistines were ethnically Greek, actually, where Goliath's grandfather could have fought at Troy. They were a Greek population, and they used iron warfare and chariots, where the Jews were stuck with more primitive bronze and slings and stuff. And so the Jews wrote the story that them fighting the Philistines were a higher people fighting a lower people. But from the Philistines' perspective, the Jews were barbarians in the hills while they owned the wealthy coastline. But from this point, you saw the formation of a new kingship, which was able to unify the Jews. And around 1000 BC, there was the creation of a Jewish state that for a very brief period, as in 1 or 2 generations, was able to take over the whole region, where under first David and then his son Solomon, They were able to knock the Philistines back to one or two cities. They were able to conquer Samaria. They were able to conquer Edom. They were able to get everything up to Lebanon. And this has been remembered more so than it's crazy how much time we spend there's two things I think about Solomon and David. The first is the long-term historic impact of a place this small, this lightly populated, that fell apart this quickly. And secondarily, whenever I read the Old Testament, I'm shocked modern Christianity exists because Yahweh in the Old Testament is like a Lovecraftian monster. And also, King Solomon's basically Andrew Tate. He has 1,000 women. David also is like Andrew Tate. These are not people with traditional Christian values. Joshua commits genocide, and that makes sense because fundamentally, the question is, can Yahweh keep them alive? Because this isn't about Christian forgiveness yet. This is Yahweh is an incredibly powerful force who is capable of crushing their enemies. And it's also interesting that Solomon was seen as the greatest of kings, but Solomon kind of screwed up and he became more tyrannical over time, where he had an enormous harem, and the Jews went through a process where they saw the denaturing of where they saw the issues you normally see with civilization, where when civilization arises, it's the breakdown of traditional social structures, the increase of inequality, the increase in government overreach. And Solomon, at the end of his reign, was seen as a failure because the greatest sin Solomon did is he made a census to tax the Jews, because they were the original libertarians. Taxation wasn't acceptable because you can't tax your own people. And he also built up the temple in an enormous palace. And so after the reign of Solomon, Israel fell apart and it became ruled by two different kingdoms, that being Israel in the north and Judea in the south.
There was probably also a sensitivity around taxes because most of the time they were controlled by a foreign empire, and that was the method or the source of the tax extraction.
Right. Right.
So it's like, hey, we got independence. Why are you acting the same way as
Right.
the foreign colonialist? You're imperializing your domestic population, which I guess is what a state is. And how does that relate to um, the difference between the natural order and something different, like separating humans from the natural order? Because you're saying that these rulers, David, were not they didn't follow any sort of Christian example, but they still distinguished themselves or held themselves to a standard relative to God that was outside of just justifications rooted in natural behavior.
What a lot of the Old Testament morality was the attempt to avoid falling back into the degradation of the local Canaanite religion. Because the Old Testament's not a pleasant moral code, and so they had to constantly fight the entropy of returning back to the traditional Canaanite religion. And so lots of things like the ritual taboos and the removal of idols is that Solomon and David, they were loved because they kept the Abrahamic God going. And another interesting variable is that Judaism at this time wasn't monotheistic. It was, so some historians, and I don't fully trust this because there's a lot of propaganda, think that Yahweh was the conflation of two different local gods into a single god. And you also have records of the worship of Venus figurines and of the local Baal spirits. And because the Baals, this is just one of those things where the jokes are too easy. But the Baal spirits were the local spirits of the creeks and the mountains and that stuff. And so Solomon and David were stopping the natural centripetal force back into the previous religion. And a point I forgot to put in here is that the current history writing thinks that the Jews invaded modern Israel and that region during the New Kingdom Egypt's rule before the Bronze Age collapse. And I just want to point out that's completely ridiculous. I see no way that the Jews could have conquered the region when it was run by Egypt, because Egypt had this huge empire. And I see the formation of the Jewish of Israel as what came after the Dark Age and the void that came after.
And so during that dark age, the myths were kind of built up to a point that
Yeah.
unrealistic.
Or I mean, the myth is that they formed this state and then they built some nice temples. I don't really see anything that's that implausible in the Bible's narrative of this. If you want to go into the actual like myth building about no, even so, I mean like the Jewish prophets don't do anything unrealistic.
Oh, I thought you meant just in terms of some broader conquest when Egypt was the top power. Um, that you
So
that didn't make sense.
the current history writing we have now is that the Jews conquered that region before the Egyptians lost control of the Levant.
Got it.
And that's what modern historians say. That seems completely insane to me. I have no idea how that became the historic consensus.
So that's different than the biblical narrative.
Oh, yeah, this is what modern historians say.
Yeah, right. That doesn't. That sounds like there's a logical flaw there. Yeah.
You saw the rise of the prophets after Israel split up. The terms are weird here because Israel's a kingdom and then Israel's also the total ethnic group. And the reasoning for that is that the Bible was written by the Judeans, and then Israel became the most successful kingdom where it had a coherent leadership that formed independent from the south. And so it's funny to read the Bible because they don't write it all at the success of Israel because it's salty Judeans. But with what the prophets were, like the prophets Jeremiah and Amos and those figures, is that they were trying to forestall the decadence that came about after the formation of a unified state. Because
Mhm.
in the period around, let's say, 800 to 600, the Jews were starting to see more and more traits like the Canaanites before. And you can view a lot of early Judaism as the attempt to avoid being like the Canaanites because they saw the Canaanites as degenerate and evil. And so the Jewish prophets talk about the they talk about the increase of inequality, the enslaving of Jews. They talk about moral degeneracy and the reverting back to polytheism, where a very consistent theme is that debt slavery was destroying the Jewish population. And debt slavery is one of the biggest themes you consistently find in the ancient world, where Babylon was destroyed by debt slavery, the ancient Greek city-states were ultimately designed by debt slavery, because this is a society, and this is why usury was banned in the Bible, where lots of the Bible's moral codes were attempts to avoid the moral degeneracy of the city culture, where the Middle East in this region was constantly a cultural battle between the city culture and the country culture. And the country culture won, that being Islam and Judaism and that stuff. And the rural people built this culture uh, around avoidance of sin and ritual taboos and sexual purity and removal of idols and all those things. And it's also why the Abrahamic tradition banned usury, because usury had such disastrous effects upon the entire social structure because there was no bankruptcy either. And I've said before in previous videos, the invention of bankruptcy is one of the best things that's happened in human history because it creates a reset mechanism, because without bankruptcy, and I'm sure you'd have seen this living in Asia, is you end up with systems where a majority of the population are in permanent debt slavery for their entire lives. And it becomes this hereditary thing where your parents build up debt slavery, and the way the system works is you can't break out. And so a lot of the prophets were speaking out against stuff like that. But what this all eventually did is it resulted in the rise of or not the rise, resulted in the breakdown of the traditional social cohesion that came about from the Jews conquering the region. And then this resulted in Israel constantly getting conquered by greater powers. And what the prophets literally said is that if you guys don't clean up your own act, everything's going to fall apart and Israel's going to be destroyed by God. Because the way they perceived God is that the natural order has certain laws, and when you break the laws, you get punished. And that's exactly what happened, where first Assyria and then Babylon just ravaged Israel.
Yeah, I mean that's perfect. When they're asking the right questions. They're starting to ask the right questions.
Yeah.
They've seen the pattern. How do you forestall the decadence of the state. It's like, in your personal life, when you have all these patterns and you can go years without questioning them, and they don't get solved until you start questioning them. And even when you do, it doesn't happen for another 5, 10 years and 200 more examples. But they're asking the right questions, which is the key
Yeah.
part. And this is still the question we ask ourselves today. It's the question people debate about with the Constitution. Like small governments end up turning into the
Yeah.
largest empires because of the contradiction of that being successful. How do you minimize that? How do you create off ramps to dependency on those structures while maintaining civilization? So um, it's pretty amazing that we're still asking the same questions.
Yes.
We've got a lot of clarity, but it's kind of the perennial problem of organized humanity.
When you look at them, the Jews had a degree of introspection and responsibility that was lacking anywhere else. Because the Jews took responsibility for their own outcomes, where they said, we have a covenant with God, and so we take responsibility for that relationship. And when you look at it, you find the Jews come across as very fallible, and they're very honest about that. They're the only people in the ancient world who are honest about their fallibility. And that's something that and I think everyone else can relate to, where I make tons of mistakes, but my attitude is once I make a mistake once, I have to be responsible for learning from it, and I can never make the mistake. Making a mistake once is excusable, making it twice is a fool. And the Jews really developed that logic where they it's funny because when I said that, they're about to get pwned really hard by history. But first of all, the Assyrians conquered Israel, and they conquered the first half earlier, and they finally conquered the second half for a briefer period. And the Jews could form their state in their very brief empire, and they were LARPing as that empire for thousands of years. In the 1800s, they were still talking how great Solomon was. They really held on to the memories of their 1 century when they controlled an area the size of New Jersey. Sorry, I keep on repeating this, but this is a hidden compliment to the Jews. I am appreciative that they did so much with so little. And Assyria destroyed them first, and then Babylon destroyed them, because after the Bronze Age collapse, there were a few centuries where you had to rebuild social institutions, and the Assyrians were the first power in that region to rebuild their social institutions. And the Assyrians have got to be one of those brutal rulers in history. They were the Prussians or the Nazis of the ancient world. They were based out of northern Iraq, and their propaganda was they would literally establish stelae, and they would have in their palaces propagandistic art of them forcing a father to crush his son's own bones and then eating his son's own flesh. Or they'd brag out destroying cities. And that was a relatively successful short-term strategy where the Assyrians were the first people to unify the entire Fertile Crescent from Iran to Egypt, but then they built up so much collective hatred that they were destroyed. And the Assyrians would ravage the Jews because the Jews were known as people who rebelled all the time. And it was really annoying to deal with the Jews because they thought they were God's chosen people. So they had this mental loop that if we follow God, God will grant us victory. And the Jews developed a sort of messianic thinking that resulted in them having a lot of suffering because they thought God determines the universe. Thus, the more we follow God, the more God rewards us the victory. And they didn't understand on a geostrategic level, guys, you're not going to win against Assyria. Assyria has 20 times your population. You guys are just going to lose. And I admire the balls the Jews had, even if it was completely suicidal. But Assyria fell pretty quickly. And then they were able to briefly gain independence before the Babylonians nuked them again. And the Babylonians, they were even worse, where the Jews kept rebelling against them. And the Babylonians got tired after a certain point, and they displaced a large part of Judea's population. I hate the terms here because Judea and Israel are the same thing, but they're also interchangeable, and people get hysterical about this stuff. And they displaced a lot of the leadership class, especially to Babylon. And there was this period called the Babylonian captivity, where there were Jews in Israel, but the leadership class especially, and lots of Jews were out in Babylon. And through that time period was the formation of the structure of modern Judaism, because earlier you had the first temple built under Solomon and the Babylonians destroyed the temple. So the Bible was formed because the Jewish elite in captivity in Babylon had to figure out, how do we structure our religion without the temple? So that's when they compiled a lot of the Old Testament, where because they started venerating the text rather than venerating the temple site, and this is the origin of the Abrahamic veneration of Scripture.
Right, because you're thinking more about the word,
Yeah,
literally logos, um, than a location, which kind of, yeah, can limit what you can do with it. That's an interesting example too of ancient blowback with the Assyrians. I feel like that also happened to Babylon when they first attacked the Hittites in that region. They created a lot of ill will, and it definitely contributed to the cycle of violence against them. Um, and like you said, I think the key, it's funny that they, didn't do so well either way because the Jews were a relatively small population, but the focus on responsibility is foundational to even the process of introspection in the first place.
yeah.
Because, yeah, what are you identifying a pattern for if not to explain the negative results as a result of your lack of following God or natural law?
Yes. And the largest population of Jews outside Israel was Babylon, and that was true until the modern world. And Kabbalah, or Jewish mysticism, stems from the Babylonian tradition, where the Babylonian mystic tradition is the origin of Kabbalah. And so that had a profound impact on all of Jewish philosophy. And the Jews got rid of their final elements of polytheism during the Babylonian captivity, where they got rid of worshiping any other gods except Yahweh, because the other gods in their pantheon besides Yahweh were too similar to the Babylonian gods. So they established pure monotheism as a way to escape any cultural mixing with the Babylonians. Because
They
any
chose
other.
their God by process of elimination,
Yes,
essentially.
yes. And the Babylonian captivity helped form a coherent Jewish ruling class, where another historic example is that when you make mistakes and they make you weaker, then uh, then that's the bad decision. But when you make mistakes, you should integrate them and figure out what you did wrong. And with the Babylonian captivity, the Babylonians forced the Jews to suffer. And this is a consistent theme in Jewish history. When the Jews are forced to suffer, they figure out what they do wrong, and it actually helps them. They use suffering as a way to improve themselves. And with that, the Jews were horrified by the degeneracy of Babylon. Because I've talked a lot about the degeneracy of the previous civilization, but Babylon in 600 BC was probably the worst. It was the end point of Mesopotamian civilization, and by that point, three-quarters of Mesopotamia's population were debt slaves, and you had mass prostitution everywhere, and you had every form of degeneracy. And when Babylon fell, the Babylonians opened the gates to the Persians because their civilization was so tired that they just gave up. And the best sign of a civilization in decline is one which opens its gates to invaders, as we're seeing now in the West. And the Greeks and the Romans would also open their gates to conquerors at different times. But the Persians were the best thing that happened to the Babylonians, because the Babylonian Empire lasted about a century and it fell apart due to its own degeneracy. And the Persians built the biggest empire up to that period of history. And there was a period around 500 BC when a majority of the entire world's population lived in the Persian Empire, because the Persians had every major single population center at the time, because most of human civilization was still concentrated in the Middle East. This was right when India, China, Europe were taking off. And Cyrus the Great is one of the almost no non-Jewish figures that gets to be an honorary Jew, because he let the Jews migrate back to Israel. And the Persians were known for being one of the most enlightened conquerors of the ancient world, where they would tolerate religion, they were very tolerant of different cultures. Cyrus the Great was seen as one of the greatest men ever until in the 1500s, people were still saying Cyrus the Great was one of the greatest men that ever lived. That's in places like England or France. So the Jews rebuilt their temple around 500 BC, and that established a pairing between the Babylonian Jewish population and the Israeli Jewish population. What happened after is that Alexander the Great conquered the entire Persian Empire, about 150 years after Cyrus the Great. And Alexander and the Greeks had an interesting relationship with the Jews, where the Greeks were much like the later European colonizers, where they viewed themselves as superior to their Hellenistic empires in the East, where they were ruling over Middle Eastern peoples. And the Greeks established their own independent cities where it was purely Greek culture, and they'd build their different Greek sites like gymnasiums or temples to the Greek gods or places where hoplites could train. And so it was the Greeks trying to conquer local peoples, but the Greeks conceptualized themselves as being superior not for purely ethnic or purely religious reasons. It's that Greek civilization was innately more advanced. And so local populations could imitate Greek culture and then become assimilated into Greek culture, where they had a version of uh, the multicultural modern civilization the modern West has, where the modern West has this ethic now that an educated person from Africa or China or India, if they assimilate into Western values, they can be treated as a Westerner. And this is used in our society as a sort of we treat it as kind, but it's really a form of imperialism from Western culture, where you could view modern leftist idea of everyone, if they just take our values, they can be a Westerner. It's a form of our own version of imperialism. And that was true in the Hellenistic East. And it created these weird cultural issues that alternated because the Greeks alternated between oppressing local Jewish populations and then trying to assimilate them. And this was reflected inside the Jews as well, where at the time of Christ, for example, where Christ was under the rule of the Romans who maintained the Greek cultural domination, is that inside Israel, and this was holistically true across the entire Hellenistic period, you had the Sadducees, who were the pro-Greek Israeli population, and they were predominantly the upper classes. And there was this whole tradition of Jews trying to explain Jewish religion through Hellenistic Greek terms. And that's actually one of the variables that resulted in Christianity, where Christianity is the mixing of the Greek philosophy with the Jewish philosophy. Then you had the Pharisees, who were the people who killed Christ. And the Pharisees were more popular among the general public, where they had this highly autistic, highly nationalistic concept of Jewish religion, where they obsessed over the Torah and the laws as a way to offset their powerlessness against the all-consuming Greek civilization. And then you had the Essenes, and the Essenes were the one that ultimately led to Christianity, where they were mystics who lived out in the desert, much like hippies.
Right. And why do you think they're the ones that led to the breakthrough? I guess they were the most flexible, creative,
Yeah, that's
not following the laws.
That's true. And when I look at the Jews, so Paul Johnson, one of the authors in this topic, said that the two peoples in this time period, in this region of the world, who had the degree to make intellectual breakthroughs were the Jews and the Greeks. And all the other civilizational trajectories had kind of ended, where in Greece or in Babylon or Egypt or Persia, their societies had kind of lived through every single philosophic iteration they had. And it's much like rock and roll, where there was almost no good rock in the 90s, because by the time we get to 1985, every single simulation of rock music you could make has already been done. It's much like rap past 2010. And I know I'm going to piss people off, but I said this purely to piss you off. And and so with the Greeks had rationalism, which gave them intellectual fruit for a lot of different things, and the Jews had monotheism. And both of them allowed basically a puncturing of the previous social order that allowed further creativity. And so the Essenes were involved in that region. The Essenes, we have a very significant amount of evidence they were using psychedelics as well. And due to being attached to this mixing of Greek and Hebrew influences, as well as being mystics out in the desert who are not part of the local civilization, the Essenes ultimately created Christianity, where John the Baptist was an Essene.
Right. And he has that kind of reputation of living out in the desert, you know, um, not quite Burning Man style. I'm just making a connection to the Mormons out west
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier.
With so the Jews were ruled by both the Seleucids, who were the Greek state based out of Syria and Iraq, and then the Ptolemies. They alternated between both. And the Ptolemies were more tolerant of the Jews than the Seleucids were. And so when the Seleucids conquered the Jews, they went through a process, and this is around 220 BC, I think, about a century after Alexander's conquests. The Seleucids tried to crush the Jews, and they illegalized circumcision and they illegalized monotheism, which then caused a revolt among the Maccabees. And the Maccabees were a radical sect of Jews who launched a revolt which actually worked, and it drove out the Seleucids, where the Jews finally got independence after centuries of being conquered. And Hanukkah stems from the Maccabee period, where when the Jewish radicals were out in the desert, they there was a period where they nearly died, and then the miracle where they survived and they could stay fed, that was the origin of Hanukkah. But Hanukkah is almost completely irrelevant in the Jewish tradition before the recent period where they needed a holiday around Christmas. And the Maccabees went through a process of forced assimilation of the entire region, where they forced all the local populations to convert to Judaism. And most Jews today are descendant people who were forcibly converted in the Maccabee period, where the Jews finally gained demographic predominance in the region of modern Israel. And the Maccabee state ultimately went through the civilizational cycle where, even as religious fanatics, they ended with degeneracy and agnosticism, as every empire does. But then the Romans conquered the region under Pompey, where the Romans had these Chad commanders, or these single cults of personality, who would just conquer regions around that part of the world or in Gaul, because the Roman system was falling apart due to the social struggles that came with the fall of the Roman Republic. And so Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, or central Turkey, and Pompey conquered Syria and parts of Turkey and Israel, because he was trying to get wealth and resources and fame, which he could use to make himself the king of, he could increase his power back in Republican Rome. And the Romans first ruled the region with subject kings like Herod. And I think Herod was an ethnic Edomite. And Herod was the king who was in charge when Christ was born. And I think he was a relatively good ruler from a realpolitik sense, but he was also quite cruel, and he was also quite extractive. And so in Christ's youth, power turned from Herod being a subject king, because he did enough different scandals that he was no longer socially acceptable to the Roman masters, until Judea just became a province of the Roman Empire directly administered by Rome.
Right, and it's hard to have you have kind of a ceiling on your reputation as a Vichy ruler, um,
Yeah.
because you're not really fully able to represent the interests of your people. You're negotiating between a conquering power, um, and then yeah, you mentioned earlier with most of the population being debt slaves, and then the the inviting people into your society is very much like they own nothing and were happy, at least content not to defend themselves. So more modern parallels there.
I see Christ's life as a great irony, because all of Jewish philosophy for this time period was obsessed with messianism. Where you look at the Book of Revelation, and the Book of Revelation was this sort of power fantasy at the time about, if we follow God enough, God will liberate us from Roman colonization. And so the Jews kept on
Mm.
rebelling, and they kept on thinking if they followed God enough, they'd get a Messiah that would let them have independence. And so this messianic tendency was boiling up in the Jewish population. They kept on saying they'd have a prophecy that their Messiah would come, and he did come, just not in the way they thought. Where,
Right, where they thought that their Messiah would lead them in a battle against Rome and expel the
yeah,
Romans. And you saw like at the siege of Masada and these other really hardcore Jewish rebel groups you're talking about, they had this insane rebel fervor, where they were willing
Yeah.
to put up with just about anything, try anything at any odds, like you said earlier, against Syria, I think. Um, so that's the source of that really intense rebel fervor. But it turns out the guy who was right was the guy who said to walk away, like go over the hills, or the Jews will have problems, or
Yeah.
I forget the exact quote. And then they did have some pretty serious problems within 40 years of Jesus
Yeah.
getting crucified.
Because Christ was their Messiah, because he told them how to be happy as being a conquered nation. Because the reason Christianity was so successful was Christianity spoke to the slave morality of the conquered people of the classical world, where Rome had turned every country except Rome and even Rome into conquered nations, where even the Romans felt like they were a slave population because they went from being a republican free people to being ruled under an absolute emperor. And so watch the Christianity video where Christ saw through the issues of the time period. He saw that the Jews weren't going to get freedom anytime soon. And so he said, if you're not going to be free, this is how you're going to be happy. And that was not the cultural thing they wanted to hear. And so that's why Christ died. And when you see why Christ was such an insane figure at the time, there's a handful of things people don't notice. The first is that the reason Christ was crucified is that he pissed off the nationalist Jewish Pharisee people, where because Christ was operating under this tradition of Jewish rabbinicism that said the Torah was radically more simple than the rule said. Because the Pharisees had this highly autistic system, and Christ, where, for example, you had to follow all of these moral prescriptions for the Sabbath. And then Christ said the Sabbath is for us. It's not. The Sabbath is something God gave us as a way to to make our lives better. The Sabbath serves us. We don't serve the Sabbath. And there's theories that he served under a rabbi called Hillel, who said the underlying nature of the Torah is to love your neighbor as yourself. And the Romans were pretty tolerant of different religions in the area, and so they crucified Christ because the Pharisees told them to do so. And very soon after Christ's crucifixion came the Jewish wars, which were they were the bloodiest war of the Pax Romana period. For the 200-year period between the rise of Augustus and the crisis of the 3rd century, the bloodiest war were the Jewish wars, which killed millions of people because the Jews kept on rebelling against the Romans, and the Romans kept on trying to crush them again and again and again. And the Romans were pretty tolerant, all things considered, but they kept on trying to destroy the Jews because the Jews would always think our Messiah is about to come, and then they'd lose and they'd get crushed again. And some historians have compared the way the Romans saw the Jews in this time period is comparable to how we see the Taliban. The Romans saw the Jews as insane religious fundamentalists in a mostly secular world. Because keep in mind, the Roman world was mostly agnostic and secular, and the Jews were this bizarre fringe group of religious fundamentalists. And you spoke at the Battle of Masada before, where Masada was a fortification the Jews had, and the Romans just crushed the Jews time and time again, where the Jews gained some earlier victories, and they were just constantly pwned. And Jewish law did not allow suicide. So when they knew they were going to lose, they killed each other. And then the final man, because they'd rather die than give up, and then the final man had to commit suicide to dishonor himself, because once they killed each other to avoid suicide, there was finally the one person who could not get killed.
And what did he do?
Oh, he just killed himself.
Oh, so he
Yeah,
took the sacrifice. But that's a perfect example of this whole dynamic, Masada, right? Because
Yeah,
they're ridiculously outnumbered. They're going to the only place that they can possibly defend themselves. It's this insane mountain fortress that's like really tall, like almost a
yeah,
Game of Thrones kind of fantasy design. They got some water, and it's basically impossible to conquer. No one's ever conquered it before. It's like Helm's Deep.
yeah,
And what the Romans do is they just build a mountain. So they build an artificial mountain on the side where it's impossible to get up, and it takes them like a long time to build, and they're just slowly moving dirt, and the defenders on the wall are just watching in slow motion horror as basically they're with no fire and no fighting, their advantage gets neutralized by the power of the Romans, like literally shaping the earth. So it's
Yes.
like this overwhelming force, um, where there's, and then they kill themselves. So that had to contribute to kind of a gumption trap towards that
Yes.
effort. Because if even that's not going to save you, they're going to build mountains to get to you. Then what's the point?
There's an interesting character called Josephus, where Josephus was a local Jewish aristocrat, and he was part of the revolt. And then when the young Nero, I believe, no, it's not Nero, it's Titus. When Titus was a commander on the front against the Jews, what Josephus said to him when he was captured is that God told me that you will be the future emperor. And then what happened is that that turned out to be true. And so rather than horrifically destroying him, Titus was grateful for this, and he brought Josephus back to Rome to be one of his flunkies. And he kept Josephus in chains. And Josephus wrote the big book we have on this, where he was trying to explain to classical audiences why the Jews were not barbarians. And so Josephus was part of the tradition of Tacitus, where you had this certain subclass of Roman authors who argued why people the Romans saw as barbarians were actually morally superior to the Romans, because the Romans got so wealthy, they had a lot of different kinds of degeneracy. And from that, so after that time period, the Romans forcibly expelled the Jews. And this is where we're going to end the story, because the diaspora happens, where the Jews were kicked out of their former homeland because they were causing too much trouble for the Romans. And the Jews were the only people the Romans ever did this to, by the way. And then the Jews spread across the entire region, and there was a pre-established diaspora population, and this diaspora population was instrumental in the rise of Christianity, where Christianity, if it was made by any demographic, it was Greek-speaking diaspora Jews, where you had huge populations in Egypt and in Syria and in Turkey, in Greece. And so with the forced diaspora, Jews spread across the whole Mediterranean, and they formed these new populations. And with the destruction of the temple that the Romans did in the first century AD, the Jews suddenly made the Torah, again like the Babylonian captivity, their greatest document. And so you saw the rise of Talmud-based Judaism due to the destruction of the previous physical temple, where the scripture became the new temple. And you saw a process of genetic and cultural mixing where the Sephardics, the Ashkenazi, and the Mizrahi deviated, where, for example, for the Ashkenazis, where the Jews who were in Spain, in France, and Italy, they married with local women. So Ashkenazis are 40% Italian and French ancestry, 60% Jewish ancestry, whereas the Roman Empire fell apart into degeneracy, the Jews actually gained a positional demographic advantage because they had stronger family structures and stronger culture. So local women were happy to marry into the Jews because the Jews had this degree of social stability lacking in the rest of the Roman world.
Right. It's kind of like you could make it it'd be a wealthy family or a good
Yeah.
place to marry your daughter into. And then I guess just to wrap up a few threads, you mentioned, the Christianity speaking to the slaves at that time. We're relating it to giving up against the Romans, but that's kind of like a cynical interpretation on of it on one level. I think the real difference is the with the attitude of the people at Masada versus what it developed into, um, was that responsibility. You can't just like throw a temper
Yeah.
tantrum and demand this now because it's right or whatever. You have to take a look at what it's going to take. You have to adopt governing
Yeah.
responsibility. You have to adopt responsibility within your society and system as it is in order to transform it into the thing that you're
Yes.
looking for. So it's another contradictory principle, but not necessarily something that's exclusively for slaves. And then the other point would be, the Rome was very tolerant. They usually they didn't really infringe upon local customs. The Usually their whole point, they were tolerant of everything except giving up control. And
Yeah.
so this ran up with the Jewish thing where they kept trying to express their independence regardless of how well the Romans treated them because they knew they're like, hey, no, this is not right. This is not consistent. This
Yeah.
is not our vision. I don't care how well you're treating us. This is the kind of thing we're trying to escape. And then that relates to Cyrus the Great being kind of respected by England and France because this was their colonial period, and they were very much using that
Hmm.
Alexander Cyrus philosophy. And you can see Alexander ported right onto Cyrus's structure,
Yes.
where hey, we're not going to change the customs of the colonies too much because that enables us to, rule over them more easily. Um, and then the last point you said, which seemed to relate to an earlier point, was with Jesus was being caught between saying the Torah was simpler than the rules. Like you're
Yeah.
reading too much into it. This is supposed to help us not make things harder. It's absolutely kind of brilliant point, and it related to the original, Jewish insight in this episode, which is that life is not fair because it's not simple. So Jesus is kind of calling back to that original spirit of simplicity of life being complicated in that statement about life being simpler than the rules in the Torah. Because
Yes.
if life is really complicated, it's not going to be simple enough to figure out with rules. So you're actually overcomplicating it by treating it like it's simple.
That's a
Um,
great point.
yeah,
And it makes me think of a couple other things. The first is that the issue the Jews ran up into is that they called the bluff for the old Roman social order. Because the way the religious structure of the Roman colonization is that the Romans found parallel gods across their empire. And the way classical civilization worked is that the empire was religion was based off the blood of the people transmitted from father to son. And so when they conquered the Celts, as example, they said the Morrigan's like Diana, and Ocean is like Zeus. And when they conquered Egypt, they're like Thoth is like Hermes. And through that structure, they established this hyper complex system of parallelisms where if you made offerings to a local god, then you were making offerings to the emperor, you're making offerings to the Roman gods. But no one actually believed this because it was an agnostic empire. It was a political fiction used to hold the empire together. And the Jews said, sorry guys, our god's the real one, your one's fake. And the Romans said, you people fucking suck. You're the one people calling our bluff on this entire social religious system. And the Jews and the Christians wouldn't shut up, which is why it's why the Romans called early Christians atheists, because the Christian concept of religion was so different from theirs, they saw it as atheism. And I've stood before, I think Marxism is modernity's equivalent, where Marxism is a new kind of religion, but it's so different from the old structure, we see Marxism as atheist. Well, it's reality, just a new form of religion. And another interesting variable here is the Jews in this time period. They were at 12%. In some ways, it's interesting. God, I shouldn't say this. In some ways, it's interesting to compare the Jews of this time period to blacks in modern America, because both are about 12% of the population. Both of them are militant. And the Jews in the ancient world, they were poor. They were poor menial workers. They hadn't become the merchant class yet, and they hadn't become wealthy. And the breakthrough where the Jews finally figured out merchant capitalism and they became one of the wealthier demographics was around the time of the Dark Ages. And my guess would be because the rest of the population declined and the Jews were able to tap into the trade networks the Muslims had.
right. Yeah, you can see how they obviously have
Yeah.
a global gypsies control smuggling,
Yeah.
like all because they travel across borders all the time and they have those connections
Yes.
and routes well established. Um, and then yeah, and you could say also Marxism is a new religion. It's also kind of like an inversion of a lot of Christian thought,
Yeah.
like the slave thing, right? It takes the if the Christianity is trying to thread a needle, then a lot of Marxism is like the overcorrection of that,
Agreed.
and that makes it easy for a reaction to bounce back from that Marxism right back to
Yes.
the other side of the middle, which you could say is
Agreed.
integrating some of those themes in a better way, like we mentioned about a perfect example being slave mentality, right? It doesn't actually mean that you have to be. This can be for more than just slaves. But it can be interpreted as something appealing to someone who just wants to tear down the structure.
Marxism is the shadow of Christianity. It has lots of Christian elements pushed in the opposite direction. And I think we covered it. This is our longest video, and I think this is a reasonable longest video to have because we covered 2,000 years of history. And so if any of our videos is going to be the longest, I'm fine with it being this one. I don't want to go longer than this in the future, though. I think 1:15 is the appropriate amount of time for these videos.
Yeah, it connects to religion and some bigger
Yeah.
topics too, so that makes sense.
Okay.
Good one.
Sounds good, man. Catch you next week for the Bronze Age collapse.
Excellent. Looking
Bye.
forward to it.